Yep. Okay. Does you want solid? Yeah, but what I have inside, yeah. But it's I will take this one. Solo montar anziana sulla con você. Right?
Right. He says, I think we're gradually trickling in. Before we start this afternoon's session, I just want to make a couple of practical announcements. The first announcement is concerning the bus to the conference dinner this evening. All of our international presenters are living in Royal, I believe, or more or less, and we will be providing shuttle bus, whatever it's called, from the university to the conference dinner and back. Now, in order to avoid delays and confusion, could everyone be outside the main car park? That's where that fountain is. Part of Socrates, maybe. At 6:10 this evening. So 6:10 this evening, outside the main university entrance, and then the bus should be going about 5 minutes later, but it's best to be there a few minutes before. The other practical arrangement is that we're going to have now a keynote presentation. Then we have one parallel section again in this one and the other room, which is actually called Theatre 2 on the updated program. And those of you who were there this morning will know that there's another lecture theatre a bit down campus here. After that, we have a coffee break. And we would like to organize a photograph on the stairs. So, I don't know if you have makeup to put on or whatever, that's the time to do it. I think I will not. That's right. Okay. Have I missed anything? No. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to present Angeline Barret, who is central in a lot of the work that we're doing in this area, and who's had, how should I put, I would say it's one of the main researchers. Of course, there are many in multilingual and language supportive education in East Africa, Southern Africa region, and she'll be telling you about what she's been doing and what she is doing, no doubt. A lot more. So I'll leave it to you, Angeline, professor from Bristol University, by the way.
Hello, bonjour, bonjour. You're probably discovering already that for somebody who does research in languages, I'm very bad at learning them. It's because I'm from UK, from the University of Bristol in UK. Tell you what. So I'm going to start by introducing my places, so you know what places I speak from. Mbogo, the South African historian, philosopher, he's written a book about provincializing Europe and deprovincializing Africa. So you need to be aware that I'll start by provincializing where I come from. I come from the city of Bristol. That's where I work at the University of Bristol, as Matt's explained, in the School of Education. So I cannot speak for everywhere. Please don't universalize from whatever I am saying. I hope that you can make sense of it, interpret it, and find new meanings in it through thinking through what it means, or whether it has any relevance for the context and places that you care about. Now, the first thing to say is I've been working more or less, do you call it doing a PhD working? No, I've been working more or less for 23 years in the School of Education at the University of Bristol. Bristol happens to be my hometown as well. So my scholarship, my educational values, I would say even my humanity is deeply influenced by my colleagues and also by my doctoral advisees. And I'm delighted that one of them is here today. And in this photo, those 5 people the time that photograph taken were all our PhD students. Two of them, I think, supervised by me. And one of them, who is laughing, has kind of influenced some of the thinking that's gone into this this presentation. That's Bexare Torres Olave. So I'm a member of, within the School of Education, I'm a member of the Centre for Comparative and International Research in Education, which does work on issues of social justice, decoloniality, epistemic justice, and you'll see that influence on my presentation. I'm kind of on the periphery of a group that is about education futures. It's thinking about changing digital technologies, what that means for education, but also about climate change and issues of sustainability. I am not part of the team that deliver our teacher education program, but I do have conversations with those people. We only offer teacher education for secondary school teachers, and you'll see that some of my presentation is influenced by those conversations with my peers. Right. There we go. But there's another place that has deeply influenced my work and my scholarship, and that is Tanzania. I was in some previous century a maths and physics teacher in Tanzania for a number of years. For the last 10 years, I've been part of a research partnerships. We've had a number of them with the University of Dodoma and St. John's University of Tanzania, which is also in Dodoma. And we have in particular been looking at this issue, problem of language transition. So for those of you that were in lecture 2 this morning, you would have heard my colleague, Dr. Elikim Sane, talking about language transition and the problems that poses for secondary school education in Tanzania. And of course, particularly we're interested in maths and science education, because when you go to the ministry and you ask them what research they want done, they say maths, science and language. Okay, now, just in case some of you are feeling a little sleepy, I'm going to summarize my argument, give you an overview, and I'll try to do that in a couple of minutes before I go into parts of it in more depth. And then I'll finish up with some examples taken from our research in Tanzania. So the title is a bit of a mouthful. It's too academic, I admit. So let's break it down slowly. And if this is working. Epistemic inclusion, what do I mean by that? Well, we've been talking about multilingual education in lecture theatre 2 this morning, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. And one of my arguments is that multilingual education has the potential to bring about epistemic inclusion, or in order to explain what I mean by that, or to give an idea of what I mean by that, meaningful inclusion. And I say that because I define epistemic inclusion as participation in processes of meaning making. Let's look at the other parts of that. Hello. No, that's not what I wanted it to do. Never get too clever with your animations. Right. There we go. Innovation is now. What do I mean by endogenous innovation or innovation for inclusion? So innovation for inclusion is absolutely the prerogative and the domain of teachers. You cannot take teacher agency out of the equation when it comes to innovation. And that's one of the reasons I call it endogenous innovation. I think in a healthy education system, you'd hope that you could also call it endemic innovation. It's about the constant micro-innovation that goes on in the classroom. And amongst the conditions for this type of micro-endogenous innovation that's constantly happening as teachers are attentive to their learners and their learning and adapt to it, one of the conditions for that is to be able to weaken, or maybe say pierce, I don't know, but the epistemic boundaries, which are often also linguistic boundaries. And Max was talking about this morning and illustrating it by waving a cane around, which I'm very pleased to see he's put away. Is anyone timekeeping, by the way?
Yes, I am.
You're in trouble if you're not, so you better check. So this may be about the institutional boundaries that surround the schools, which very often in a lot of contexts are also linguistic boundaries, but it may also be about how rigid are the boundaries between the different subjects that we teach in secondary education. So now let's go into more depth, and I'm busy pressing on the wrong arrow. Aha. So let's now talk about endogenous innovation for inclusion in a little bit more depth. Classroom teaching is the art, science, craft, and practice, as well as the theories of constant micro-innovation for inclusion. Some of you would have heard about Donald Schoen's idea of the as teachers as reflective practitioners. He expressed teacher professional knowledge as knowledge in action, an idea that was taken up by Clandinin and Connolly later. As in, teachers know and are attentive to their learners and are constantly making adaptations in order to meet their needs. So it's not just about adapting to individual learners, although that is also part of it, but also the community of learners that you have within the classroom. I'm going to quote from a paper that was written by my colleagues at the University of Bristol, who all teach on our programme for secondary school teachers. They're saying that the reflective practitioner thinks independently in advance of the lesson about the plan and resources to be used, taking into consideration their own strengths, affordances, and any limitations in the light of their knowledge of students' needs. It involves keen attention during the lesson and introducing adaptations where necessary. It also involves reviewing the lesson afterwards, specifically how the plan and resources were able or not to foster learning, informing the planning of the next one, by which I assume they mean the next lesson. Some of you may have been engaging with Hattie's work because that's quite popular at the moment, and Hattie writes about assessment for learning. And I guess there are some similarities in the idea. But I do think that when we think about the reflective practitioner and we think about micro-innovations, then that draws attention to the importance of freedom or autonomy. Barret once described education as the practice of freedom. But this isn't a wild, untamed freedom. It's educated and informed. And hence I use this idea of endogenous, which comes from the work of Pauline Hontonji, who is the Beninese philosopher and sociologist. And he uses this phrase endogenous knowledge and says he prefers it to indigenous knowledge. Endogenous knowledge is outward looking. It's engaged with what is going on elsewhere. It selects, adapts, and it indigenizes. It makes that knowledge the knowledge of the people who are here to serve the purposes of the people who are here. So that is what I mean by endogenous knowledge. And endogenous innovation is innovation which comes about through educators engaging with research and engaging with other educators. There's a second thing I need to say about innovation for inclusion. The second way in which it is constrained by policy, including curriculum frameworks. So education and policy, therefore, needs to be designed to provide the structure and framing that enables pedagogic innovation at the school and classroom level. Part of my title, The Local Roots, is inspired by a paper that was written by Joe Samoff, Marshall Dembele, and Sebatane. They conducted a literature review and they published it in various versions from 2001 up to 2013. The title that I like the best, they had different titles, those papers, but they're all based on this literature review they were doing, was Going to Scale, Nurturing the Local Roots of Education Innovation in Africa. So what they were doing was reviewing literature on, they were interested in education reform, and they were reviewing the literature on initiatives that started at a small scale and then were scaled up. What they found was rather disappointing. They said there have been many imaginative, exciting, and sometimes dramatic innovations in education in Africa, but few that started small have been successfully scaled up. What doesn't work, they say, is trying to reproduce the Pacific innovation. I could give you a recipe now for some of the things that we have been doing in Tanzania, but trying to reproduce that exactly wouldn't work well. What needs to be scaled up are the conditions that nurtured and sustained the innovation. And so policy and curriculum need to find that fine balance between structure that nurtures and enables, but doesn't stifle pedagogic innovation. And I'm very sad to say that in Bristol, we're erring on the side of stifling pedagogic innovation. Education has been organized so that we kind of have corporates running chains of schools, which are called academies. And in order to preserve their corporate image, they're constraining the freedom for pedagogic innovation. They are dictating to teachers the type of pedagogy that they should be using in the classroom. One of my colleagues, John James, described this as stultifying pedagogy, describing how as a teacher educator observing these lessons, he finds it boring. He feels very sorry for the students who have to suffer this day in, day out. Overwhelmingly, the schools that are implementing these types of policies are schools that are serving the more disadvantaged areas of the city. Across the country, we now have young teachers leaving the profession of teaching, not because it's too demanding, not because it's long hours, they're leaving because they are bored. This pedagogy is also boring for the teachers. Some of you may have seen that image already. So I've spoken about endogenous innovation. Now let's turn to epistemic inclusion. What do we mean by epistemic inclusion? As I said, epistemic inclusion is about learners, all learners, participating in meaning-making processes. It concerns learners having access to the curriculum as it is specified, but it also concerns recognition of the knowledge practices of learners and their communities, which may mean flexing, bending, expanding, and being critical of the specified curriculum. These two things are linked, they're interdependent. You can't get access to the specified curriculum without recognizing the knowledge practices of learners. Or as Angela Little once put it, you have to meet the learner halfway. It means that learners have the freedom to interpret curriculum content, to articulate understanding, including through imperfect exploratory talk, to draw across a linguistic and meaning-making repertoire, sometimes talking within school in the ways that they talk outside of school. It's about making connections between out-of-school knowledge and curriculum. It's talk about school learning outside of school, learning how to articulate ideas in school in a way that you can then talk about with your fellows when you're and with your family and with your community members when you're outside of school. It is also about structured support and instruction to articulate ideas verbally and in writing using standardized forms of language. Once again, language is central to all of this. The subject of inclusion is the individual learner, as I said earlier. All are bright and beautiful, diverse children and young people who have their own peculiar ways of knowing and making sense of the world and their own set of capabilities for making sense of the world around them. But no one is just an individual. We come into this world belonging to communities, to families, to societies. We come into this world with histories, with identities, with cultures, sometimes into religious communities as well. As Robin Wall Kimmerer says when she's talking about her people, indigenous people in North America, we are dreamed into existence by our ancestors. So this is also about respect for individuals, is also about respect and recognition for the communities to which children belong. Power operates through curriculum and education institutions by creating and maintaining boundaries, including epistemic and linguistic boundaries. I could talk about boundaries in a couple of ways, but I'll talk about the boundaries around formal education, between what does count as formal education, what is inside the school, college, or university, and what is outside. I'm currently editing a special issue. One of my co-editors, Anthony Essen, is here and is presented already today. And a number of papers that have been submitted to this special issue are to do with the boundaries between the language boundaries between the language practices within schools and the language practices out of school. Milligan Ngoma and colleagues have written a paper about English-only policies in secondary schools in northern Uganda. And they describe the use of corporal punishment. We were waving the cane. Oh, where is that the cane over there? Right, okay. And humiliation being used to punish children who are caught speaking their own language in school. But Lizzie Milligan explained to me last week that policy, when she and her team members explained what they had observed in secondary school to policy in secondary schools in northern Uganda to policymakers in Kampala, the policymakers were shocked. Corporal punishment is against the rules. The schools are not supposed to be administering corporal punishment in Kampala, in Uganda. So they were shocked that this was happening. Another one of the co-editors of the special issue, Prem Fiak, has talked about schools in Nepal. And he's written about the policing of language in English medium instruction schools in Nepal, describing the use of CCTV cameras around the school premises, making teachers and students fearful of speaking their own language in parts of the school where you're only supposed to be talking English. And also the use of teachers and students expecting them to report on people that they hear speaking any language other than English. However, this is not the full story. Bagwasi and Costley, writing about Botswana, describe a slightly different way in which policies are enacted. Setswana is the language of learning and teaching for the first year of primary school, after which schools are then supposed to switch to using English as soon as possible. Is a policy of serial monolingualism, if you like. You switch from being monolingual in one language to being monolingual in another. It's similar to the ideal that Eliakim Sane was describing for Tanzania, except there it's 6 or 7 years of Kiswahili medium education before transferring into English. However, in Botswana, teachers and learners just could not maintain the boundaries between the languages. And what the Bagwasi and Costley actually observed in Botswana was this constant translanguaging, this constant fluidly moving between languages. In Tanzania, we have observed all these practices. We've observed teachers code switching and translating. We've observed, or just using Kiswahili throughout, as sometimes happens. We don't observe that. They won't do that when we're there observing, but it happens. We've observed schools administering corporal punishment and humiliation, requiring some students to be surveilling their classmates in order to maintain English language. So we've seen both those boundaries being transgressed and those boundaries being maintained, depending on the school and what the school level policy is. If we step back, though, there is a reason that language matters to schools, particularly to secondary schools. One of the objectives of secondary education is to teach learners or to apprentice learners in standardized language or the formal registers of their language. This is one aspect of what Michael Young called powerful knowledge. I'm going to use the way Wilhelm talks about powerful knowledge. She's talking about the knowledge that's within the secondary school curriculum. She says it provides access to society's conversation about itself. Students need to access disciplinary styles of reasoning so that they understand how knowledge is used and the broad criteria that need to be applied in evaluating the validity of arguments. Okay, so we need to acquire the standardized forms of languages. However, sociolinguists going back to the 1980s at least, Michael Halliday being the person who's mainly associated with this, have observed that acquiring the formal registers of standardized language involves back and forth between familiar languages and rather informal ways of talking and formal language. So teachers and learners within a classroom may be moving back and forth between formal and less formal ways of expressing their ideas. That's just within a monolingual environment. But we do also need to scrutinize the basis of powerful knowledge. Powerful knowledge and the knowledge of the powerful are not as easily distinguished as Michael Young would have us believe. Think about it. The formal registers of our languages most closely resemble the informal ways of talking of often the wealthier social classes within society. What becomes standardized language over the years is not entirely neutral. Decolonial scholars, including Arathi Sriprakash, Sophie Rudolph, and Jessica Gerard, have critiqued the Eurocentric basis of the secondary school curriculum. My subject used to be physics. Physics is a subject that, on the face of it, well, that is about universal laws of our natural world. And yet somehow we have covered it, inscribed it with the names of European scientists, mainly male European scientists. The universal laws have Newton was here scrawled all over them in the same way that you might see graffiti tags all over my home city of Bristol. Rudolph, Sriprakash and Gerard argue that disciplinary knowledge has a shadow or dark side. So the knowledge of the curriculum has been tremendously empowering for us and for our societies in many ways, but it also has a dark side. And they're referring to the colonial violence that accompanied modernity, i.e. the modern era as we know it. They're writing, or that time, Arathi now lives next door to me, but at the time she was writing from Australia. And one of the forms of violence of which they would have been very aware as they were writing this was the systematic erasure of Aboriginal knowledge systems. This was the most shameful act of ignorance by European settlers in Australia. And there's a very ugly word for it, epistemicide. They also make the point that much disciplinary knowledge is everyday knowledge that has been appropriated by academics. I say this just to remind you, it's a point worth remembering when listening to a keynote delivered by a professor. Anyway, going back to secondary school science. Secondary school science isn't much like science as it's taught in university. It's selected knowledge presented in a particular way that exaggerates the European contribution to what is our common human heritage and tends to neglect or acknowledge non-European contributions, of which there are plenty. It should be interrogated at every step by curriculum designers, educators, and students. It should be interrogated by students from the perspective of their everyday knowledge. This is a part of the process of making sense of the secondary school science curriculum. And I seem to have skipped the slide that we should have been looking at all this time, or, oh, it's not there. Never mind. So I use the example of water is alive. So a lot of indigenous communities in the Americas talk about water as if it is alive. Water is, the example I'm taking is from Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she's talking about her process of learning her own indigenous language because she didn't grow up learning it, and very few people did, of Potawatomi. And she talks about the electrifying experience of learning to say that water is a bay. You don't talk about water as an object, you talk about it as a being. The water is being a bay, is how you would say that. And there's this idea that water is alive. It is an idea that has actually been taken up by water engineers trying to understand some of the problems with flooding, particularly in Chinese cities that have been built over. And they've had to accept that water has its own mind and decides where it's going to go. And if they think about water as being alive, then they can find the solutions to stop the flooding in their cities. So yes, inclusion for all, or is good. Inclusion for all is good for scientific literacy for all, meaning that all children have the scientific knowledge that they need to negotiate their way through life. But it can also help us to be better scientists, including those who become specialists in their field. It can also make them better communicators of their knowledge. This was a point that came up in our questions in lecture theatre too, and to be ethical thinkers. Because inclusion that appreciates the richness of diversity enriches and enlivens education for all of us, and can also enrich and enliven disciplinary research. I'm saying it's a win, 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 win. We just keep on winning if we're prepared to be a little bit less rigid, if we can be less rigid about the epistemic boundaries around the school. So now, I've been talking in very abstract and theoretical terms up to this point. So now I'm going to draw on some examples from our research in Tanzania. I said we'd had a number of projects that have now been going on for a little bit over 10 years. So where did it all start? It started in 2013 actually it was the Tanzania Institute of Education, came to us with the problem of textbook design. And the problem was that the textbooks that are being used for the first year of secondary school, so it's the first year for the majority of students, it's the first year of English medium education, were the students couldn't read them. They were to be honest, students of the same age in the same grade in England would really struggle to read these books. And so we started thinking about how you could design secondary school books in a way that would be more accessible for learners. And one of the images you see here, not the fish and eel traps, that's from a book, Australian book for children, is showing the way that the boundaries can be broken down. So we introduced some Kiswahili into those books, but we introduced it, if you like, in the margins. So the reason why here you can see an example where we have a glossary, we provided some translation of some of the terms that you need to know in order to read the book. Okay, Anthony, you were talking to me earlier you gave us the example of a textbook and saying in order to read a textbook that was in French, you had to keep using the dictionary over and over again. Well, it was similar here, except the kids, most of them don't have dictionaries. And so we just provided that information right there on the page. That allows the students to make connections back to their primary school education. So, for example, I could set them a mathematics topic. We did this with a discussion group. We set a problem in mathematics that involved calculating a perimeter. And these focus groups, as groups of 6, 7, 8 students, would just look at us blankly. And then the facilitator said one thing. She said, perimeter means Mzingo in Kiswahili. And immediately went, and solved the problem. Sometimes it's not difficult to help students connect back to the knowledge that they know. There are other places we gave little explanations in the margin. If it's directions and they really need to know how to do this, how to solve a mathematical problem or how to conduct an experiment, we gave the instructions in Kiswahili in the margin as well. That's one way that we were kind of weakening the language boundaries that works. Kind of. The books were still very hard for the students to read. They still was a problem. After that, the researchers who'd been involved in that project then said, you know what we have here in these books? What we have in this books is the beginning of a pedagogy. It's what we call language supported pedagogy. Let's take this out into the schools. I said, hang on a minute. Have you tried doing this yourself? They were all teacher educators. So the next thing we did was actually a teacher education project. So that pictures those 3 people, or at least 2 of them, from Mbogo Teachers College, who trying to figure out how you do language supportive pedagogy. And what we had was just a series of these action research projects going on in 2 universities and in 3 teachers' colleges. And it's again an example of endogenous innovation. We're trying to work out how to do this through this process of action research. And at the same time, we had different institutions doing this and people from those institutions coming together and talking to each other about what they were doing. So there was this kind of sharing of ideas with other educators. And one group that kind of made some of the most radical changes was the group working on biology education at the University of Dodoma. And one of the lead people in that was Dr. Prosper Gabriel. And he described the kind of development of their insights in this way. He said, we always used to get together and chat. We quite like each other as colleagues, but we didn't talk about our work. We didn't talk about teaching. This project made us meet together as a team. So we had teams of language specialists working with science educators. So we had to break down some disciplinary boundaries and have people collaborating across those boundaries. But when we did start talking about our teaching, you know what? It was really interesting. And we found we quite liked talking about our teaching. But then as we carried on with the project, the design of the study required attention to the learners. So doing some kind of baseline evaluation, but also looking at what some of the learners with different abilities were doing in the classroom, and then having a quick chat with them afterwards. Over time, we realized that our attention should be on the learners, not just thinking about our own teaching. And that can happen quite a lot. I know it happens a lot in Tanzania, that we like talking about our teaching, but this focuses the attention on the learners. And it's then that they started making some quite radical changes to their pedagogy and the way they delivered. It was a unit about pedagogy, about how to teach biology education at that university. And so that is an example of what I would say was an endogenous innovation in teacher education, where that process of collaboration across subject disciplines and of attention to learners is perhaps the thing that should be scaled up rather than the specifics of the pedagogies that they designed through that process. And finally, my last example is a lesson that, again, Dr. Sane was referring to amongst many examples this morning. But it was an example of a lesson that was drawing on students' Indigenous knowledge. So this was a lesson being taught in a remote rural area where most of the community, most of the students, nearly all the students, were Maasai. So their first language, the language of their community, was Ma, which is not a Bantu language. It's very different from Kiswahili. Then they start primary school, and that education is that's their first language transition into using Kiswahili. And then the ones that are fortunate, when 50% of the young people, roughly 50%, carry on secondary education. And the teacher came into the classroom with carrying these plants. Did he carry the plants, or did he ask them to go and get the plants? I can't see where. Oh, he asked them to go and get these plants, which is amaranthus. Okay, the amaranthus plants. And then he asked them about the amaranthus plants, because this teacher was also Maasai, and he knew that they knew really quite a lot about plants. They knew more about plants than was in the biology curriculum that he was supposed to be delivering to them. But that knowledge, they couldn't express that knowledge in English. This was knowledge that they had acquired from their community. It was Indigenous knowledge. But he encouraged them to articulate that knowledge, to tell them what they knew about plants, which they did using Kiswahili, already their second language. After which, the teacher then gave them the structured support to be able to express that knowledge using English. Okay. Max was explaining this morning that you can't just throw English at people, at children, expect them to turn into fish. I can tell you, it's really not happening in Tanzania. Those kids are not turning into fish. You just dump them in English immersion, it's not working, they're sinking. I can tell you the extent to which they're sinking. We also did some research in Zanzibar. So the transition in the language of instruction in Zanzibar happens a little bit earlier than in the mainland. So from the 5th year of primary school, they start using English for learning science, mathematics, technology, and geography. And then in the mainland, they start in Form 1. So that's about 3 years of English medium instruction that the children in Zanzibar have had. 3 years more of learning science in English than the children in Tanzania. When we went to the government schools, not the elite schools, not the Philippine schools, but we went to the government schools and we assessed their knowledge of science vocabulary that in English, so their knowledge of the English scientific words. We found that the students in mainland Tanzania performed much better on that test than the students in Zanzibar. The more you throw English at them, the earlier you start in the public education system, the more they're thinking. Okay, so that was another one of our observations. So this science class is a positive example showing how a teacher was able to kind of cross the epistemic and linguistic boundaries in their class, in his classroom. And we found it in the unlikeliest place. We didn't find this in an elite school. We didn't find this in an urban centre. We found this in a remote rural area. Perhaps because it was a remote rural area, this teacher felt like he had a little bit more freedom and autonomy. No one was kind of gazing at him too closely. I don't know. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I've finished. There we go. So this slide is just showing some papers. So I know I've been drawn on examples and I haven't provided a lot of systematic research evidence. If you want to read the systematic research evidence, I say there's pages and pages and pages of it. And it's available on the University of Bristol website. We've got 3 different reports that have come out in the last 3 years from the last of our project, plus some reports from earlier projects. Thank you.
Well, Angeline, you're the first one to keep time today. Extra calls for that. Fantastic. Any questions, please? Yeah, go on.
Thank you very much, Angeline, for this presentation. I was more interested in the last example you gave about Tanzania. No, yes, about Zanzibar and Tanzania, in mainland. There was a study in Oman that says that if we start teaching English language, because the first official language in Oman is Arabic, so if we start teaching English to students at grade 9, they would be much better performing in English as a second language than if we start teaching them from grade 1. Because it says that from grade 1 they are kind of confused between 2 languages, Arabic and English. So what do you think of this?
Well, I only had the example from our own recent research in Tanzania. I do know that Jim Cummins has been writing about, well, a long time ago, for a while, he wrote about cross-linguistic skills. So what he was saying is, again, Jim Cummins is often cited. If you go and look at his papers, he isn't somebody who's just writing something because it's his opinion. He cites a lot of research and a lot of international research and often large surveys to back up his arguments. The idea is that when he talks about cross-linguistic skills, what he's saying is once we've developed some skills in a familiar language, it is easier to then acquire those skills in another language. So if you have a master's on the academic registers, I'm going to go back and say something about that in a minute, but if you've mastered the academic registers of a familiar language, when it comes to trying to acquire the academic registers of an unfamiliar language, that's going to be a little bit easier for you. Some of the evidence of this is actually coming from places like the US and from UK, where we have internationally mobile teenagers, as I say. We have people coming into our education systems, particularly with the refugee crisis from Syria. We had a lot of young people coming into our education systems who'd actually had a very good education in Arabic, but were then coming into English language education systems. And in the US, people who were working with those students found that if they had enough of them, if they offered them, went to the regular classes and then had some extra classes for their same subjects using Arabic, they then acquired, they then performed better in their subjects in both Arabic and, well, in English as well as in Arabic. And again, that's about the cross-linguistic skills. They were acquiring those formal registers in Arabic, and therefore they were then able to learn them more quickly in English. So I'm not entirely surprised. It's great to have that piece of evidence that you're finding something similar now as well. So thank you for sharing that, Sal.
Thank you. I just want to speak about the class where students were shown holding classes. If you can display it again.
I think I'm going to need the technician's help.
That is not. Yes, different because the people have understood the learners not even understood Swahili well. So the teacher allowed students to use my kindness and Mala. Classes in Tanzania, students are seated attentive, don't are not talking. It's unusual to find a class where students are standing and smiling in class. That is because my language was welcome. Students were asked to explain the names of the plants in their language and the functions of those plants in their language before they turn into English.
Thank you, Ellie Kim. Yeah, as I said, you win and you keep winning and you win and you win again. And one of the ways that you win is that the lessons can be more fun. I'm aware that I've had a couple of questions from people who know me quite well. So can I ask that you just all take a few minutes, a couple of minutes? I can't time keep. I want somebody else to time keep. Just take about 2 minutes and turn around to someone so you're sitting close to, and I threw a lot of theory at you. So just take a little time to talk about it and chat. And perhaps after that, we'll invite some questions again. How about that, Matt?
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. So turn to the person next to you and reflect over what's been said. Is that correct? Yeah? Okay, feel free. Two minutes pass very quickly when you're having fun. So we invite you to ask a couple of more questions before we move on to the parallels. So anyone eager to communicate or ask anything to Angeline after this is done? Yes, here we go.
I can just share an experience. I've worked in Mbogo for 20 years with the school, and over there, like 40% of students entering grade 1 did not speak the language of instruction, which is German, but they have to learn German, and in grade 2 they learn French. And this was switched by the time they reached grade 7, and everything switched to French. And the students failed math 50% in grade 1 because they are foreign, half of them, and they struggle with understanding language. And so they know that a supervision level of the language, but when it goes into the technical part, they then start to make from which one to use, and they find coping strategies different. So this is also interesting that they come with their indigenous knowledge, which is easier, and when they emerge, they go. But so in Luxembourg, what they're trying to do now is to try and get an immersion from the in the very beginning. So they teach them to learn to read up to grade 4, and then to read to learn through immersion. So when I was listening to the whole example, it's interesting how they do learn. Just share it.
Yeah, thank you. What works is going to be different in different contexts, right? And it can be very different in different contexts. But when you're talking about first or second generation migrants coming into an education system, it reminds me of the point about power. And sometimes, or very often, I think the decisions that are made when it comes to language policies, they're not always made with the best interest of the majority of learners in mind, right? There is power implications. I was talking earlier about the example of Rwanda, where they've now using English from the first year primary school onwards. But everybody, the lingua franca, the language everyone's fluent in, is Kinyarwanda. It's quite an authoritarian government, and Kinyarwanda is also the language of politics. It's the language of the newspapers, and so there are other political implications and implications for political participation. Particularly if sometimes your economically most wealthy people are being educated in such a way that they're not confident articulating their ideas in what is the language of politics within a particular country, right? So yeah, these decisions are never neutral. Thank you.
Right. Okay, I think call it not a day, but end of session there. And Claude, Angeline, thank you so much for super. So now we have two parallels before we there goes my computer. Before we go on to the coffee break, could you just okay, so the order of the day is that those wanting to listen to the Mauritian presenters, Aruna and Kiagaki, is that correct? Yes, by Pascal. Stay here, and those wanting to listen to measuring inclusivity in higher education, and this is by Vijaya Rama, the Kulan and Toshima, and also all names there. Anyway, they go to the other theatre too now, and then we meet outside here for a coffee break after those two sessions and a photograph session. Thank you.
Yeah, Brendan Privini.
Ouais, merci. Păi n-a, parcă am venit în click ăla.
Oui, voilà. Donc, on va faire live stream.
Ok, ouais, le là, moi, pas besoin.
Ferme ça.